All right, so welcome to Man Morning. I got to tell you, this week's topic was chosen by my wife, and I think it'll be very funny and kind of fitting when you see what it is. Um, John Paul II has this line where he says, he's talking about the church. He says, to be loved by Christ and to love him with spousal constitutive of the church's mystery. So at the source of this is this free act of love, which the Father pours out through Christ and the Holy Spirit. And this love forms the church and is radiated to all creatures. Okay, so far, so good. I think we all understand this idea. But he draws from this the idea that therefore all human beings, both men and women, are called through the church to be Christ, the Redeemer of the world. And that is kind of a shocking claim, I think. Because when we talk about these different identities we have as men, we don't normally say bride of Christ. Like normally when we say bride of Christ, we mean either the church or maybe women religious. By extension, we kind of get how maybe all Catholic women can kind of bear witness to this in some sense. But certainly I don't hear a lot of guys going around talking about the way that they are at the level of their soul called to be a bride of Christ. But John Paul II is saying exactly that. So I wanted to say, like, what is going on there? But first of all, I think the question to ask is just like, well, is he just totally off base? And the answer is no. That there's an actual biblical basis for this. So to take this really controversial passage from Ephesians 5, St. Paul says, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Now, this is like one of the most politically incorrect parts of the New Testament. And so I think we often get really hung up on the most obvious level, this notion about the relationship between men and women. But the analogy only works when he compares men and women to the relationship of Christ and the church. The analogy only works if the church, which we are all part of, stands in the bridal role to Christ. In other words, our relationship to Christ is, so to speak, the wifely role. And so this is something that I think is often easier for women because the relationship they're called as Catholics to have to their husband and to Christ is a little more analogous than the relationship we're called to have to our wife and our kids, as opposed to our relationship to Christ. Now, that could be really messy, that could be really misleading, but I think the readings this week actually give us everything that we need to understand what is and isn't meant by this idea. So in this idea of the Good Shepherd. So just to give you a little preview of where we're going to go. As men, we are called to be shepherds in particular context, to be a shepherd for your family. If you're in charge of a business, you might have different kind of pastoral leadership roles, even in the parish. Obviously, Father Al's going to have a special relationship. All of that, I think we get, we are attracted to, and we focus on. But what we don't focus on enough, I would argue, is what does it mean to be good sheep? So first, Christ in the gospel, we heard this on Sunday and Monday again. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own know me. As the Father knows me and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. It's a beautiful description of what it means to be a shepherd. But notice what he says after that. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will heed my voice. So there shall be one flock, one shepherd. Now, last week, I think most of you were here for it, Chad talked about this, the way that Scripture is this story that we enter into. And so you might say, where am I in this? And thanks be to God, it's actually very clear. Like when he says that there's going to be one flock and one shepherd, he's referring directly to us, right? Like, so we are that flock. We're the flock of Christ. We're called to be the sheep. So in this stained glass window, You're not called to be Jesus most of the time. In this parable, in this analogy, you're called to be the sheep who's led by Jesus. That makes sense? So with that in mind, are we good sheep? And I want to suggest that the recipe for good sheep is going to have 3 parts. That we need to cultivate receptivity, divine receptivity. That we need to cultivate trust. And then we need to cultivate obedience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just throw out each one, and then we can just talk about it. And then we'll move on to the next one. We'll talk about it. We'll kind of go in that order. And I'm also going to mix in a lot of shepherding kind of imagery. So we've just seen Christ as a good shepherd, but I want to turn next to a different kind of shepherd. These are the shepherds of Bethlehem. Pope Benedict XVI talks about this. He says the first thing that we're told about the shepherds is that they were on the watch. So remember, like, the shepherds are the ones who hear the message of the angel because the shepherds are the only ones who are awake in the middle of the night. So they could hear the message precisely because they're awake. And so, the Pope says, we must be awake so that we can hear the message. We must become truly vigilant people. So receptivity is going to be connected with this idea of vigilance, which is maybe a more masculine word. Maybe you're more comfortable with that, but they're really similar kind of concepts. Well, he says, what does this mean? What does it mean to be awake? Well, the principal difference between someone dreaming and someone awake, the dreamer is in a world of his own. His self is locked into this dream world that is his alone and does not connect him with others. To wake up means to leave that private world of one's own and to enter the common reality, the truth that alone can unite all people. I think one of the easiest ways we see this idea of the dream world that takes us away from reality right now would be something like pornography. You have this kind of world of fantasy that takes you away from your wife, takes you away from your family, takes you away from your responsibility, takes you away from reality into this purely private world, basically of your own imagination, fantasy, and unreality. But there are a lot of other, like, maybe you've got a different area where you find yourself engaging in kind of an unhealthy escapism that draws you away from who you're meant to be. And Pope Benedict's message to you is wake up, snap out of the dream world, come back to reality, because only if you're living in reality are you going to hear the Lord of reality. Because in your dream world, you can be the God of that world, but the God of the real world is God himself. So if you're wanting to hear God himself, get back into his world, which is the real world. It says awake, step outside, enter the great communal truth, the communion of the one God. And he says to awake then means to develop a receptivity for God, for the silent promptings with which he chooses to guide us, for the many indications of his presence. In other words, maybe the way that you go into a dream world is just not being aware of the world around you. That you go through your day and you're just oblivious to what God may be saying to you. Maybe you're plugged in, maybe you're on your phone, maybe you're just distracted, maybe you're thinking about 20 other things, and you're just not aware of the present moment. You're not aware of what God might be saying to you, and all these very, these many indications of his presence. And so Benedict points out, there are these people who say, they claim to be religiously tone deaf. Now, on the one hand, the gift of a capacity to perceive God, sometimes it does seem as if it's withheld from some people. But it's also true that this way of thinking and acting, the mentality of today's world, this whole range of our experience is inclined to deaden our receptivity for God, to make us tone deaf towards him. In other words, it isn't like God hasn't given us ears to hear, it's that we've plugged headphones into those ears, and then we complain that we can't hear him. And in fact, in every soul, this desire for God, this capacity to encounter him, it's present either in a hidden way or overtly. Everyone is a religious seeker. Some people just know it. So that's divine receptivity. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to unmute everyone. If you've got questions you want to throw out, comments, thoughts about this. Going once.
So Joe, what occurred to me was when I'm deep into an assignment or a project that I'm working on, how that I'm focused on that, and that's all I'm thinking about. And afterwards, I'll ask myself, now, did I do that the way the Lord wanted me to do it? Am I attacking the issue correctly and all? Do you have any thoughts about how to integrate that into? I mean, at my age, you got to focus if you're going to try to get something done. But how do you be aware of God's presence in that kind of a situation where you're trying to focus on a project?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say first of all, I'm no expert in the sense that this is something I've also struggled with. It's really easy to get really fixated on the task at hand, and to at the end of it, like you said, be like, "Oh, God, what did you think of that whole thing?" I just, like you get kind of totally enveloped in whatever you're working on. I've mentioned Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection before, with the practice of the presence of God. And so I think when we talk about being aware of God's presence, we don't mean you have to stop and pray a rosary in the middle of work. We don't mean you have to like stop everything and cease paying attention to the thing you're paying attention to. Like if you're driving, you should probably pay attention to the road. But if you can be mindful of God, meaning just simply aware of God's presence. So again, using this image of driving, like if you're driving with your wife, it's a totally different experience than if you're driving alone. I don't just mean because she might like criticize the way you drive. I mean like you're just aware of the presence of another person in the vehicle. And there's also, I think, like I drive differently when my wife and kid are in the car. I drive a little safer. I'm a little more aware. If the light turns yellow, legally you're allowed to go through it in Kansas anyway, but I often won't. Those little things. That's what I mean there. Where you're still focused on the road, you're still focused on the task at hand, but in a way that hasn't forgotten God. And the best I can say is just that it kind of practice makes perfect. Like, or practice makes less bad. Like, you'll find all of these principles, they're very basic. In theory, they're very easy to apply. And at the end of the day, you'll still say, I forgot 50 times and I remembered 5. And that's better than remembering 3, And so then maybe tomorrow will be a little better.
Gotcha. Being mindful of God, that sounded to me like that was the key phrase there.
Yeah, absolutely. And
it occurs to
me. And being mindful of God looks different ways, like the way I just mentioned. But also, I think Benedict has in mind just being appreciative of the things God's put in your life. A beautiful sunrise, garden, the day you have, your health, your house. Like we've had a lot of things taken away from us in the last 6 weeks. But I think we've also been maybe made more aware of things we'd taken for granted. And so there should be a lot of reasons for Thanksgiving. And I think those are one of the places that we find God. Like we have an entire day in the U.S. dedicated in theory to Thanksgiving. We don't know who we're thanking. And then we mostly just fill the day with getting ready for Black Friday to like buy more stuff. And so I think we need to recover that sense of Thanksgiving, that sense of gratitude.
It occurs to me, Joe, that if you are driving and you are going to a location that you really need to get to but aren't familiar with, in just former days, let's say a few years ago, you would have a map. Now you have to put the destination in a GPS. So what is our religious GPS? Well, it's a prayer life. And that destination is a relationship with God and a developed prayer life and a focus on the destination that we want is integral to listening and having a frame of mind that we're constantly hearing from God, and not, as you said, be religiously tone deaf.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I think that's a good way to describe it, as a map or the GPS.
You might, instead of calling it GPS, JPS for Jesus Positioning System.
Thank you, Greg Brown.
All right. So that's the first one, receptivity. The second one is going to be a short one, because I think it's pretty straightforward. Trust. We need to develop a sense of trust. But I think to understand what makes this so hard, I want to give the example of what's called the Creophoros. So if you look at those images, you might be inclined to think that those are images of the Good Shepherd, and they're not. They're actually from about 500 years before Christ. They're ancient Greek religious images for what was called the Creophoros, or the Hermes Creophoros, which meant basically like a ram carrier. But there's a fascinating difference here. So we know about this from the 2nd century Greek who was describing this, and he was saying, well, as a way of thanking this god Hermes for saving their city from a pestilence, they had this religious ritual where a young man would carry a ram on his shoulders and then take the lamb and slay it. So I'm struck by this. I think it cannot be a coincidence how similar the religious art of Christians looks to this ancient Greek religious art. But notice the pivotal difference. The Greek god was going to eat the animal. Jesus is going to tend the sheep and even lay down his life for it. So in the case of the Greeks, like, the lamb is the sacrifice, the ram is the sacrifice. In the case of Jesus, the shepherd is the sacrifice. He's the one who lays down his life for the sheep. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think that's pivotal to how we understand trust. Because at the end of the day, trust is basically allowing Jesus to drape you around his shoulders and carry you know not where. And some part of you is going to say, how do I know he's the good shepherd? And that this isn't like the Creophoros. This isn't the guy who's coming along to destroy me. So that's it. That's it in a nutshell. I think trust is straightforward. So I'm only giving that simple example to hopefully evoke some kind of idea, because I think we understand the idea of trust intellectually. I think where trust gets really difficult is in the practice of it. And the reason is because some part of us wants to make sure God isn't going to just devour us and destroy us, right? Thoughts about that?
Joe, it seems to me right now that if I would struggle with anything, that's it. And I think America, maybe, and not America, the world, that if you really believe and can say, I trust you, God, I trust you, Lord, that you do the appropriate things to be careful, but when you panic and you basically are saying, what we have said as a world is that each individual life, and we lost 80,000 people to the flu 2 years ago, and there wasn't a word in the newspaper about it. Now we have people dying. It's clear there's a virus that's killing people. It's part of nature, frankly, and let's hope. But if you trust in God and you're doing the appropriate things, none of us are immortal, but we treat every death as if it's, we count each death. Maybe that's good or bad, but it seems to me that we're really rejecting or ejecting this notion that I trust you, God, and I trust that if I were to get sick and die today or this week or next week, that this is part of what the plan is for us. How did we do today? There's no guarantee I'm not going to get hit by a car tomorrow any more than killed by the coronavirus. So at any rate, that's all.
It's a good way of putting it, because I think what it draws to mind for me is this scene in, I believe it's Judith chapter 8, And the city is surrounded, it's under siege, and they're wanting to take the city captive. They want to steal the holy things of God, this enemy of Israel. They want to destroy the religious goods. They want to enslave the people. And the people hold out for a few days, but they have no food and they have no water. And they start to despair and they want to give up. And so they go to the town elders and they say, hold out a little longer. We need to give God time to act. We'll give him, I believe, I'm going off of memory here. I believe they say we'll give him 35 more days. But then Judith rises up and says, you're both wrong. Because you're still putting God on a timetable. You're still saying, God will trust you if you do things the way I expect it to go, if you don't make it too hard, if you don't make the sacrifice too much. And what's really striking is when you figure out the number of days total it would have been, all told from the start of the siege, the town elders wanted to give God 39 days to act. Well, if you think about it, 40 is this number of preparation throughout Scripture. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years in the desert, 40 days with Noah's Ark, etc. Like 40 is this time of preparation. So it means symbolically they're trying to cut God's time of preparation short because it's inconvenient for us to have to hold out. That's a good way of thinking about the problem of trust. Is we will sometimes, you know, the people, the normal townspeople, they had very little trust. The elders had more trust, but they still didn't really trust, right? Like really trusting God means, I trust that you'll do my plan because my plan is so good. Really trusting God means we're going to do your plan, and I don't really know what your plan is. And that's a lot harder. So I would say, you know, be gentle with yourself if you find it's difficult. You know, it's worth remembering St. Peter walked on water and still struggled with trust, right? Like he still looked down in the middle of an incredible miracle. Like it's easy to judge St. Peter for that, but like none of us have even made it to the walking on water part, right? So like someone who is like doing this amazing thing, he had the boldness to say, Lord, if it's you, call me out to you on the water. You know, he's asking for this miracle. God gives it, and he still doesn't really trust it because it's very hard for us to trust. There's a deep-seated thing, even at a bodily level, this desire for self-preservation means that we have to really make an act of the intellect and an act of the will to say, no, reasonably, the all-powerful, almighty God, he can take care of me. I know that up here, right? But in my guts, I still gotta overcome all those feelings of, I'm going to do everything myself. That's the battle of trust. I think that is really related in practice to the third part, obedience. And so let's turn now to obedience. Because one of the things we just said is, what if God destroys you? Like we were just talking about with the ancient Greeks. The Kriophoros, like that lamb's going to be destroyed. The ram's going to be slaughtered. So what if it costs everything? And that's the real test with obedience. So I wanted to start by just sharing my own struggle with obedience, which I think can be captured well by Tennyson's famous poem, Charge of the Light Brigade. So for those of you who may be familiar with it, the Charge of the Light Brigade refers to a real event that happened during the Crimean War. There was an order that was supposed to have the British light cavalry capture some Russians before they could take off with some leftover equipment. Long story short, they're basically pursuing people who were fleeing, which is what the Light Brigade exists for. Somewhere along the way, the order was vague, it was misunderstood, and they were instead sent on a forward, full frontal assault, which is not what light cavalry is for. They don't have nearly the armor to do it. They don't have the weapons to do it. It's basically a suicide mission. The incredible thing about it is the Light Brigade did it. They got their orders. They knew. They're not idiots. They know this is a suicide mission, basically. Of the 600 of them, I think 100 to 200 were killed just in this one event. And I think there were fewer than 200 who still had horses capable of fighting afterwards. I mean, this was an insane kind of event. It made papers around the world. The French marshal, who was an ally, said, "It is beautiful, but it is not war. It is madness." In response, there was this sense of something went insanely wrong here. But coupled with that, a real respect for the radical obedience that these men had in the face of what they had to know was a bad idea. So Tennyson sits down and very quickly writes this now famous poem. And these lines are the most famous. It's, "Forward the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. That Tennyson viewed as amazing, as beautiful, and as heroic. And when it's other people, it sounds like all of those things. But when you feel like you're the guy in the light brigade because someone has given you an order that just seems stupid, either God or a superior in your life, it doesn't feel so noble and so amazing, right? Like, that's the problem with obedience. That's the challenge with obedience. A priest once told me, we promise chastity once, or celibacy once, but we promise obedience twice. So the promise of celibacy is made just at the diaconate ordination. The promise of obedience is made at both the diaconate ordination and the priestly ordination. And he said, the reason is it's twice as hard. That obedience is harder than chastity. It's harder than celibacy. It's also, though, more beneficial. And I think it's a really underappreciated virtue. So going back to the Old Testament, there's this scene in 1 Samuel where Samuel says, "Has the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." Now, it's easy to do a lot of sacrifices on our terms, you know? I don't know if you're guilty of this. In the past, I've been guilty of this, doing Lent in kind of the wrong spirit, where it just becomes like me choosing some things I either knew I had to give up for my own good, or just wanting to like do something really hard out of this sense of like, I like a challenge, but it's still on my terms, right? Like, the difficulty, the real beneficial, beautiful thing that goes beyond sacrifice is true obedience. And Pope Gregory talks about this verse. He says, yeah, in the law, obedience is preferred to sacrificial victims. I love this distinction. In sacrifice, you're sacrificing the flesh of another being. But in obedience, you're sacrificing your own will. And so he says, anyone who restrains the pride of his own judgment before God's eyes, sacrificing himself with the sword of the command, will correspondingly appease God the more quickly. I think that is a beautiful, profound, and deeply challenging insight. That the real sacrifice isn't giving up chocolate or beer or even hot showers or whatever. It's really just giving up me being the commander of my own ship, me being the master of my own life. And that's a much bigger sacrifice and a much more pleasing sacrifice to God. But in that, we're talking about this idea of what if it costs everything? And there's a sense that, yeah, it really might cost everything. That's when you give up your own life in obedience, there is occasionally a sense in which you literally give up your own life. And we see this in the sacrificial lamb, Jesus. He's not only the shepherd, he's also the lamb. And so in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." In other words, Jesus puts such a premium on obedience to God, fidelity to God, that he follows it even to the cost of his own life. And he shares it. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane is this prayer is something that only Jesus was present for. The disciples were asleep, and they weren't right there. So the only reason we know this is because Jesus thought it was important that we should know, hey, I prayed this, and then I went ahead and went to Calvary for you. Something is being taught to us in the midst of that. Now, that is divine obedience. And as you can probably tell, it's hard enough. But human obedience in some ways is harder, because I know on some level that God has better ideas than me. I don't know that you guys do, right? Like, I don't know other human beings have better ideas than me. So I'm much quicker, much freer in my mind to second guess. And so I wanted to say a little bit about that. So the first thing is, what are the limitations of human obedience? In Acts 5:29, St. Peter says we must obey God rather than men. So the hard limit is, if you're commanded to do something that is sinful, you can't do it. If you want to know what that practically looks like, I'd say Ephesians 6, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, what did you expect from your kids? Or what do you expect from your kids? Now, maybe they don't do it, but in theory, they should obey anything they're ordered to do by their parents, unless it would be sinful to obey. In other words, if it's not sinful to obey, it's sinful to disobey. So unless you're telling your, if you're telling your kids like, hey, you need to blaspheme God, well, they need to disobey you. But short of those kind of radical cases, which we're usually not facing, we're called to obey the authorities over us in our life. Now, who are those authorities? The president, the governor, the mayor, the bishop, and your pastor. And notice there's no promise in there that any of those people are going to know more than you do, right? And just like there's no promise that you're going to be smarter than your kids. I think any teenager will tell you that they know more than their parents. And sometimes, on some issues, they're actually right. It doesn't matter, because the parents are still put in this position of authority. Here again, the obvious example is the Holy Family. So after the finding in the temple, Jesus comes down, he goes to Nazareth, and is obedient to Joseph and Mary. Well, think about it. If there was ever a case where the kid knew more than the parents, there's the case. The child is God himself. And yet, the head of the household is the one sinful person. And so, like, the authority structure and the competence structure are totally inverted, right? Like, the person who is most qualified to run the family is obedient to the other two. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that it doesn't matter. It's okay if the person calling the shots doesn't know as much as you do. Maybe, and here we get into a really practical issue. Maybe you have the kind of relationship you can talk things through and say, hey, you said we should do X, but maybe we should do Y instead. Or maybe you should just do X because it's not going to hurt you to do X. It'll only hurt your pride because you think you've got a better way of doing it. A lot of those are practical decisions. I'll just give you a few words from Scripture and from the saints, kind of guidance on it. The first one, from Hebrews 13, to obey your leaders and submit to them. And here's a critical part. For they are keeping watch over your souls as men who will have to give account. Let them do this joyfully and not sadly, for that would be of no advantage to you. In other words, if you obey, but you make it so miserable for the people in charge, you're not really gaining anything through that kind of half-hearted obedience. That's not actually the kind of obedience that's pleasing to God. It's of no advantage to you to make the lives of your superiors miserable. You should let it be a joyful thing. And the reason you should let it be joyful is they are carrying an extremely heavy burden. We don't often talk about this, but they're going to be judged for the decisions that they're making, and they know it. Or at least most of them know it, right? And so you can help make their life a little less scary, a little easier, by just being a little more cooperative. St. Philip Neri has a great kind of concept that I think is really analogous to this. He says, he who always acts under obedience may be assured that he will not have to give an account of his actions to God. In other words, we have this promise by God that we'll be liable for every idle word that we speak. Everything you say and everything you do, you're going to stand trial for. And that's kind of scary. But St. Philip Neri points out, you don't need to worry about that. If you can say, God, you put this person in my life, they said to do this, it wasn't clearly evil, and so I did it, even if it was really dumb. Even if it was like the worst of 5 ways you could solve a problem, I did it this way because I respect the authorities you placed in my life. And you're good to go. That's it. Now, the person in charge of you is going to have to explain why they went with the dumbest way rather than the other 4 ways, right? So they're the ones who have to give an account. As long as you don't make yourself bishop and pope and president, you don't need to worry about it. This is a radical thing, is that obedience, properly understood, is really freeing. What we keep wanting to do is fall back on our own judgment. And the consequence of that is that we're asking God to judge us as if we're in a position of authority that we're just not in. So we're taking on a burden we can't possibly bear and which was not given to us to take on. And I think that's foolishness. Okay. Say rents to sales. I'll just mention here, the saints have so much stuff on obedience that if we don't sound and think like this, we're not thinking with the saints. Francis de Sales gives very practical advice, as he always does. He says, obey in things hard, disagreeable, and inconvenient. And therein was very perfect obedience. Moreover, obey quietly without answering again. In other words, without talking back. Promptly without delay. Cheerfully without reluctance. And above all, render a loving obedience for his sake, who became obedient even to the death of the cross for our sake. Who, as St. Bernard said, chose rather to resign his life than his obedience. In other words, Jesus knows a thing or two about costly obedience. He lived it. He lived through all of the quiet annoyances that probably involved growing up in Nazareth and having to obey different adults in town who knew way less than he did and may have had some silly ideas. But he also knows what that kind of obedience looks like because he followed the will of his Father perfectly, even to his own death. So if you can take all of the little annoyances, all of the little ways that you're called to sacrifice through obedience and offer them to him, that's a very pleasing gift. And he knows what that costs. He knows what that feels like. The last thing, I wanted to come back to this Pope Gregory the Great quote, and I wanted to think about it particularly in the context of coronavirus and public masses, because I don't know about you guys, but I have heard so much complaining and second guessing about what the bishop should have done, what the governor should have done, what the mayor should do, all the way down the line. So if we want to make this really practical, think about all of the conversation. Like if you open up Facebook or if you go online today, I can pretty well guarantee that you'll be exposed within about a minute to someone who has no authority trying to say what people should do. And based on nothing more than their opinion, which is probably not supported by anything, not backed up by like any real research, any real facts, just kind of my own gut says we should do X. And as Americans, this is something we fall into all the time. I think I've used this example before. I was reading a newspaper in St. Louis once, and they were describing this court case, and they said there was a hung jury. The jury couldn't decide if the guy was guilty. What do you think you decide? And I thought, that is insane. Like a jury heard this entire case and couldn't figure out the right answer. I've read an article from one guy's perspective, and I'm supposed to determine the guilt or innocence of a person I've never even seen before. Like, that's an insane point of view. We fall into that way too easily. Like, all of us have become disease experts and economic experts in the last 6 weeks. And I think we just don't really have the schooling to back it up. But more importantly, we haven't been called to those positions by God. Now, I'll bite my tongue if any of you are on some sort of advisory council for the bishop where he's saying, tell me what I should do about public masses or, whatever. But barring that, probably the most pleasing thing we can do is restrain the pride of our own judgment before God's eyes and sacrifice ourselves in the sword of the command. Because if St. Philip Neri is right, the one thing we can be sure of is that God is not going to say, why didn't you disobey the bishop and come to Mass? But if we do disobey, he's going to have some words for us. So, if we want to be good sheep, these are the things that we need. We need to be awake and alert. We need to be receptive and attentive to the will of God. We need to be trusting, and we need to be obedient. The beautiful thing about sheep is precisely that they are obedient. They go, they're not obedient voluntarily all that often, but they're easy to carry, right? And they're not very smart, so you can kind of herd them in the right direction. I think it's telling. The last thought I'm going to throw out there. In modern culture, if you say someone's a sheep, you mean it probably derogatorily, right? People say like, wake up, sheeple, and, all of this idea that you don't want to be a sheep. Well, Christ is calling us in a certain way to be sheep to him and to the authorities that he's placed over us. That's not easy. And I don't want to pretend like it's easy. I don't want to pretend like I live that perfectly. I constantly am fighting that voice, second guessing the opinions, the decisions of people whose job it is to actually make those things. But yeah, that's all I want to say for now. So now I want to open it up. I'm unmuting, and we'll see what you get.
Hey, Joe, you just taken away all the fun I've been having about pissing and moaning about coronavirus. So next week be a little gentler. But you're absolutely right. I think we've all done it. We've all been guilty of it. I certainly have of second guessing almost every decision. I really second guess. I mean, the Archbishop's got a tremendous responsibility, and so do our pastors. The governor, who I have little respect for because of her stand on abortion. I mean, we're slaughtering kids every day, and we're leaving the liquor stores open. So sometimes I do question her judgment, but really, you're absolutely right. We've all being obedient at these times is extremely difficult, at least for me. I don't know about the rest of you guys.
And let me be clear that when we talk about obedience, this doesn't preclude the ability to do things like protest the liquor stores and abortion clinics being open. If there's something immoral happening, if you're closing churches and leaving abortion clinics open, it's appropriate as a Christian to stand up and say that's not right. We hear a lot about obedience from the Christians in the New Testament, but it's worth remembering that they were still killed for refusing to follow Roman laws that would require them to sacrifice to idols, right? So there are times and places where you have to take a heroic stand, come what may, even if at the cost of your own life. One of the questions I got kind of privately was, well, China demands the supreme obedience of people to party at risk of death, and they demand this kind of perfect obedience. So how do we avoid kind of that logical extreme? That's a good question. And the short answer is exactly what Scripture said, that we must obey God rather than men. If you really want to get into the idea is this. Public authorities, meaning both the church authorities and secular authorities, are established by God. In John 19, when Jesus is before Pilate, Pilate says, "Do you not know that I have the power to condemn you or to set you free?" And Jesus responds, "You would have no power unless it was given to you from above." In other words, all earthly authority, all valid earthly authority, comes from God, which is A, why we should respect it, but B, why it can't go further than the law of God allows. Think about it this way. Like if you hire a lawyer and you say, "I want you to settle this case for between $5,000 and $10,000. And the lawyer goes in and says, "I'll give you 20. He has exceeded the bounds of his authority. He's exceeded what you've authorized. Now, you've given him a range. You've given him a scope where he can use his prudence, his judgment, his human skills, and all of that. But there are boundaries he cannot cross." That makes sense? So it is too. If we believe the authorities, the public authorities come from God in some sense, meaning they get their power ultimately from God, that means if the state tells you to do X and God says don't do X, the state has no authority on which to claim it. Now, this is, interestingly, both the foundation for why Christians obey the state and why we take obedience so seriously. It's also, paradoxically, the foundation for the whole idea of civil disobedience. If you read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he quotes Augustine and Aquinas, and he explains, because he's posed this question, which I think is a good one. At the time, they're disobeying Jim Crow segregation laws, but they're also calling on the government to enforce Brown v. Board of Education desegregation. And so his critics are saying, how can you disobey one set of laws and demand the other set of laws be enforced? Isn't that hypocritical? And he says, no, because any valid law has to correspond to the law of God, because all law-giving authority is ultimately derived from God's law-giving authority. And that segregation laws or laws that treat one group of people as less human than another, they don't meet that basic standard of justice. So therefore, we're free to disobey them. The line from Augustine and Aquinas is, an unjust law is no law at all. So understand, this is a part of the civil rights movement history that's been totally lost. Like, there's a reason it's largely pastors at the front of it. They have a whole moral system that says, here's how we know when to obey and disobey. And it's all about, does it correspond to the law of God? We've erased all of that. You know, if you go to the Martin Luther King Memorial in DC, there's no reference to God anywhere on it, but you can't make sense of the movement without understanding how deeply it's immersed in this theology and in this natural law. So that's kind of long-winded, but hopefully you can see that we are called to obey unless it's sinful to disobey. You don't even have to turn off your mind so much as just know that maybe you're not the person who has to make all of these decisions. And the same way that, look, when you're at a restaurant and you see the way somebody else, this is a dated example, you may remember restaurants. But there's a family at the table next to you, right? And their kids are rowdier than you remember your kids being, or they're on their phones or any of these things. And what's your first judgment? Like, you're wanting to say, I wouldn't do it that way. Fine. You probably wouldn't. But guess what? You're not the dad of that family. So unless you're being invited to actually go over there and like give counsel and say, hey, buddy, here's how to raise your kids, then you're probably not called to silently judge them. And you're probably not called to like go and complain about them later when you know, are like, can you believe the people who were there at the table next to us? Those are not the things God's calling us to. So analogously, like if you're in a position where you're being invited to give some counsel or advice to the bishop or the mayor or the governor, by all means, employ your human reason to figure out the best solution to all of these problems. But you're probably not called to just second guess the judgments they're making and complain about it internally or on Facebook. That's not what God's calling the saints to do, right? Like, we don't see the great saints sitting around complaining about what the Medicis are doing in their local town in Italy. Remember, they lived under worse rule than most of us do. And yet, they didn't just spend their time complaining about politics the whole time. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, etc.?
Yeah, Joe?
Yeah.
Well, I think the problem I have with what you said and what's going on is I see the things that the government officials are telling us we have to do, and many of those things are completely unconstitutional. They are abridging our inalienable rights that cannot be taken away by the government, yet that's what they're doing. And my complaint with the bishops and the priests is I don't believe that they are following God's word by taking away our churches and withholding the sacraments from us for the stated purpose of trying to control this flu or for any reason whatsoever. Not this flu, not a plague, not pandemic, not world war. There is no justification that I see for our church leaders to withhold the sacraments and lock our church doors. And there's no justification for any government official to tell us we cannot gather, we cannot do with our own personal property whatever we want to do. If we want to engage in commerce and there's someone that wants to come into our business and engage with us, they cannot constitutionally stop us from doing that. So I believe that obedience, yes, but not if what they're telling us to do is wrong or immoral, And I think that's what's happening, in my view, from both the government standpoint and our church leaders' standpoint. And I believe in that circumstance, I believe God is calling us not to obey, but to stand up and fight against that.
So this is a very helpful question. I think it allows me to clarify a point, which is, I just said that there are times and places where we may be called to like civil disobedience, right? Where an authority gives an order that it would be sinful to obey. So I should make it very clear here that the bar here is very high, that it has to actually be immoral to comply with the authority that God put in your life. And so if we're going to do that, we have to be darn sure that we're not just falling into the most vicious of sins of pride, which all of us, every one of us struggles with. And so if I'm weighing on balance, do I know more about the Constitution than every governor? Do I know more about, the demands of God than every bishop? 10 times out of 10, I'm going to come to the conclusion that probably I'm in the wrong on that many people wouldn't be wrong. There's this line Martin Luther had later in life where he talked about how when he was first starting the Reformation, he was plagued by these doubts. And the doubts were, are you alone just? In other words, if you're disagreeing with everybody in authority, either God has decided to do something very new, or you're just not in the right. So I don't mean that to be rude. I don't, but I just mean to say, the idea that what God wants us to do is rebel against every one of his bishops, point to anywhere in the history of the church where that's been what God has wanted us to do. And I think you'll find that that's not the case. I think also.
Okay, Joe, on that point, when in our history have we ever closed the churches or stopped giving out the sacraments?
Multiple.
Not when the Romans were feeding us to the lions.
Archdiocese of Washington in 1918, they closed all of the churches. At various points with plague, the churches have been closed. In the 1930s in Mexico with persecution, the churches were closed and went underground. At various times and places because of natural disasters, because of disease, we've had times where the church has temporarily been closed. I mean, right now in the Amazon, people were going 6 months between receiving the sacraments just because of a lack of availability of priests as just the norm. So the idea
that's a whole different subject.
Well, what I mean is that we're not being asked to just go without the sacraments. What we are being asked is to go, so far, what is it, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, without the Eucharist, except in cases of emergency.
If I can jump in, I think there's a practical side to this too. We have an aging diaconate and we have an aging priesthood along with our bishops. We all are called to have sacrifices and sufferings. And I think to sit back and look at this as a temporary thing is what we need to do. I understand. I don't know if any of us on here are lawyers besides Joe. But, I think those are all things where people are feeling frustrations. But there's a very practical side to preserving the church also. And I would ask you to reflect on the age of the priest, their potential exposure, and the amount of time it takes to get people who are willing to serve, not only the time, but the people who are willing. So I think there's some practicality associated with this also.
Yeah, the last thing I say, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the practical with this. I would just say, like, if your conscience tells you you cannot, in good conscience, obey, I think you're mistaken, but you have to follow your conscience. But yeah, to your point, the average age of priests in the U.S., Scott, is 63. I don't know what it is in this diocese, but it's probably around there. Meaning that, we were told basically stay away from high-risk groups, meaning older people, and the average priest is in that group. So we're putting priests in a situation where they are going to get sick and potentially die or become vectors for the disease, because these are also the people who are going to visit the sick. So if we make it where our demand to have the Eucharist every day or every Sunday means that the people who need to take care of the sick and dying aren't able to do that anymore because now they've got the virus, we haven't preserved the sacraments. We've denied the sacraments to people who need them more than we do in this moment. But again, there's a lot of other things that are going into all of that. I would just say this is not a decision any bishop has made lightly, and we see very good bishops who are making this decision. So I would just say basically just need to get into all of the details as to why, because that's not the position we've been called. We're not called to make that judgment call. Maybe if you or I were bishops, we would do things differently. Thanks be to God, we're not. And so I think we have the freedom to obey when the sacraments are offered and where they're offered, and not to disobey the bishops. Okay, it's a good conversation, but I want to give some time for small group questions. It's 7:46 now. I'm going to break us out into groups for about 15 minutes, 14 minutes, and just look at these 4 questions. I don't think you'll have these questions in front of you, so just try to remember them. So number 1, where in my life am I religiously tone deaf to the voice of God? 2, where do I escape from reality and enter this dream world that Benedict was talking about? Number 3, has my response to the shutdown been one of trust and obedience? And number 4, do I find it easiest to practice receptivity, trust, or obedience? And which do I find hardest to practice? Okay, got them? I am now going to split us into groups. I'll stop recording first.